For the next part, I want to switch gears a little bit and start talking about how to use this as part of the web page. Sure, this is in my web page, but it sure looks like debugging output or like a list that doesn't really mean much from a user's perspective. So if I want to add something in here or some structure, I can come up before this block and I can create that structure. Let's create an unordered list. We'll come down after this looping structure here and create that end tag for the unordered list. We're going to turn these into list items instead of a div. And if I hit save, you'll see it turns it into a list, a bulleted list. We could even say, for instance, this is a select, and we'll end the select, and these will be options. Now, more work has to be done to actually make this work, but this is the idea. How quickly you can use an array as the data for a component. And this week, we're going to have a little fun, and we're going to create some generic classes for grids and flexboxes. So check this out. Using our BEM naming, I've got two blocks created for flex and grid. Everything else is a modifier. So if I use flexboxes, I can make them into rows or columns. I can justify either one to the start, center, or between. For grids, I can create 2, 3, or 4 columns or 1 column on auto width. I can adjust the gap, and I can align start, center, or end. So horizontal, vertical alignment, and spacing, as well as grid columns, are all accessible using utility classes. Now, what does this mean? This means that we can start using them like BEM components. But instead of creating a grid for every single time we use a grid, this is a generic way to create a grid. If we don't want to have product grid and products grid and homepage product grid, you don't need to have the grid be the component. The grid can be generic, because if you just need a grid to be thrown up quickly, we don't have to BEM it and name the whole thing and create a custom class set for each one. It's always going to be the same. So what I can do is go back to my file here, and I can turn this back to a div. And we're going to turn these into divs too. So what we can do on this outer div is now we can say class equals flex, for instance. Okay, and you'll see that my list gets a little weird. And to see this, just remember I put debugging on inside of my div above this. The container has debugging on. So when I add my debugging for flexboxes, this should show up. Okay, and if I take the debug off here, you'll see that it doesn't work. We'll put debug back on here. If I want to create a modifier, I could say flex column right here. That was one of the choices we had, but I got to use 2 dashes for the modifier, and then it'll become a column. Now the reason we want to do this is because we can justify center, or we can align center and create a gap that's medium. That's kind of a big gap. We can change that back to small. So see how by setting up utility classes, you can actually sort of program your HTML elements without having to go back up to your CSS again. It's sort of a different way of thinking about it, but it's really good for things that are generic or don't need specific block names or elements. Okay, let's switch this around then. Let's come back in here. We'll take all these back out, and I'm going to add one for grid instead. And we'll say debug grid as well. This will turn it into blue lines. Now if I say grid 2, you see it turns it into 2 columns. Or grid 3 turns it into 3 columns. Let's see if gap works. Yeah. And then we'll say justify, 2 dashes, and align center. Okay, align center didn't work because grid doesn't have a way to center align the text. So what we have to do down here is I have another utility class called text align center that I could add down here instead, and that'll center the text. But you can see now each block is vertically centered. If they pile up like that, or some blocks take up more than one line, we can see that each block does vertically center. As you continue developing, you might want to change the classes or add your own as well to make this even easier, but you can see how flexible this becomes when you're developing. Again, if you don't need that really specific grid, you can just use a generic one or a flexbox to set up page structure really quickly.